All right. So I read your book. Very interesting. And it's always nice when authors share some personal insights into their subject that they wrote about. So I'll just ask you to start there. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book partially out of frustration and partially out of excitement. Frustration because I am so fed up with the mental health care system, both as a person who's been through it as a patient and as a clinical psychologist. And excitement because I really do think that there's a path forward for expanding access to services that isn't widely known, but should be and could be. And that's really what drove me to write the book. And so Little Treatments, Big Effects is about how one session of therapy can do something meaningful for people, or even brief experiences or interactions can serve as turning points for folks to sort of put them in the right direction towards mental health, well-being. And I'm really interested in the science of this and dissemination and implementation. So the book sort of had to happen.
Nice. So your personal story. You had an eating disorder, right? At age like 12 or something. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So at onset, when I was 12, pretty rapidly, middle school is tough. I think that's a universal truth, right? And for me, it was really swift and really severe into a lot of difficulty around body image, low weight, that became really dangerous really fast. And when I was 12, that was back in 2002, I remember my mom just on the phone for hours on end trying to find somebody who had an opening at their clinic, somebody who wasn't exorbitantly expensive, somebody who could help me, and kept coming up empty over and over. And not for lack of trying and not for lack of wanting to connect, just because the system is so overburdened. And, I eventually, after years, I struggled for really close to 15 years with this, eventually got help, but had to go through so many treatments that were ineffective, so many treatments that weren't appropriate for me, and just so much junk that I now know a lot of people who navigate the mental health system with a serious mental health problem have to go through. And what finally actually started helping me wasn't actually something that happened in therapy. It was something that a patient said to me when I went into intensive treatment again as a graduate student. I know it sounds funny when you say it like that, but believe it or not, cheese caused incredible levels of distress for a long period of time. So this other patient who was in the same intensive outpatient program as I was, asked me, what made you try your fear food today? What made you actually be able to do that? I said, well, I don't really know, but I just did it because I don't think I'm ever going to feel ready to do it. And she faced me and said, what if that is the whole thing? What if that actually is what recovery is? Just deciding to do incredibly hard things, even if you haven't done well the day before, even if it's still really hard, not expecting it to not be hard, just going for it. And at first, when she said this, I was like, what are you talking about? I've tried so many treatments, so many approaches for so long, like there's no way that could be it. And eventually, when I had some time to think about it, it actually kind of was pretty much it. And I started trying to take her advice of just like, what if this is hard and it's okay and I can do it anyway? What if I don't have to be ready to recover to take a step towards recovery? And that approach, that mind shift for me was critical and probably more helpful than the years of therapy I'd had up until that point of just allowing myself off the hook for having to be ready to recover in order to take steps towards it. And that was not, that couldn't have stood alone as the treatment that I received for anorexia. It was very complicated. There were multiple team members involved. It did take a long time, but that shift in framing made such a big difference for me. And I'm convinced it could have happened a lot earlier, and that could have saved me years of failed treatments. I'm convinced that it could happen for other people who are seeking mental health support. And I think these moments can be systematically constructed where people have an important change in perspective, an important motivating difference that they experience that can matter for them. And the crux of this book and of my lab's research is, how do you make those moments for people? How do you help people get to that aha moment or that turning point more quickly and more efficiently so that doors to recovery can be open? And I don't think this is going to replace other approaches to serving mental health needs in people. Of course not. Everyone's going to need different things at different times. But I do think they can give these important shifts and boosts to folks that would overall have massive public health return if we could actually get them disseminated.
So in your previous therapy sessions, were they looking for like deep root causes, relationship with your parents or background, or let's go back 10 years or whatever?
Yeah. Deep root causes. Why did this happen? And I loved to intellectualize everything because that meant I didn't have to do anything. So much easier to just talk about why the struggle is going on than to actually take a hard step, right? So I was more than happy for a long period of time in my recovery, because I was so treatment resistant, to just sit in that intellectualizing space. In other treatments, it was more prescriptive, like top down, just telling me sort of this is how you have to do things, taking away a lot of agency and choice that I had, which is, a big problem with eating disorder treatment in general. But nothing that actually allowed me to just sit with distress, sit with unreadiness, and still take these steps that felt brave and hard. It was never framed to me like that.
Interesting. So regardless of what the cause is, if you can even figure it out, don't worry about that. Just solve the solution. What's the problem that needs to be solved right now?
Yeah. And in some ways, you can still figure out, what the root causes are if you want to. That doesn't prevent you from taking these steps that matter right now. But the idea that there's always something that you can do, even if it feels insurmountable, is really powerful. And that's something that I heard over and over again when I talked with people who've also had turning points in their mental illness recoveries of their own for the book. I basically posted on social media like, hey, who's had this turning point thing in their recovery? And a lot of people have. And that came up over and over again of realizing that, wow, I can do something I didn't think I could do.
Interesting. Can you just tell me a little bit about eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia? I don't know much about it, so let me be the stand-in as the idiot that doesn't know anything and ask the dumb questions. I mean, what's the problem? Do you just lose your appetite? Is it that the body image thing overrides normal hunger?
So that's a great question. Eating disorders come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. There's the most common one actually is binge eating disorder, and others are bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa. But overall, it's a distorted image of your own body image, and a really dysfunctional relationship with food, such that food becomes a tool to use for unhelpful coping, either not eating in order to cope with emotional distress, or overeating in order to cope with emotional distress. So it's a way of expressing distress through food, which of course, as a woman, there's a lot of attention, cultural pressure put onto body image and weight and appearance. So it's kind of a manifestation of all of those cultural factors coming out in a way that is a coping strategy, really. For me, I was using it to have control over something when a lot of stuff in my life when I was younger felt very much out of my control. A lot of adolescence is marked by things feeling uncontrollable, socially, developmentally, physiologically. So that's a really common onset time for eating disordered behaviors, because people just need an outlet, a coping mechanism that they can access and actually feel like they can control, even though it ends up becoming out of control.
So in your case, this is the time when teens become very concerned about comparing themselves to others, body image, and all that stuff. And therefore, your normal hunger impulses and appetites that would be there are just suppressed because of this. In other words, it's not like a rational choice, like, oh, I'm really hungry,
No.
but I also want to lose weight. It's just you just don't want to eat anymore, or you just have some
Yeah.
larger impulse.
Yeah. So for me, and I can really only speak for myself here because everyone's manifestation is slightly different who struggles. Um, but I was fixated on having a very regimented course of what I ate during the day and having as much control over that as possible. And following specific rules that I made up in my head and became sort of like the rules controlled me rather than I controlled the rules. But it felt like something to focus on. It was a distraction from the distress that I was experiencing in my day-to-day life. And for a long time, it worked in that in the short term, I was distracted from all the other distress. This was all I could focus on because also as you lose weight and all of that, you're physiologically more attuned to focusing on food and nothing else. So it is kind of this reinforcing cycle of, yeah, it's effective sort of in the short term, but it becomes something uncontrollable very quickly.
But if okay, pardon my dumb questions, but if being skinny is the norm that we've adopted for how women should look like, and you get super skinny, at some point you're too skinny. So you don't look at the mirror and go, you know what, I think I better eat some food because I'm not looking too good here. Again, it's not a rational calculation
At
like
that
that.
point, it's so far beyond one, being able to see yourself realistically, and two, being able to stop. So it is a self-reinforcing, somewhat addictive cycle where that's all that you can think about and all that you can do and all that you have to comfort yourself. So it gets pretty scary. And I was I'm in unfortunately, good company with a lot of folks who struggled with this, who just do get to that dangerous place and don't know how to stop it without external intervention.
So if you do go to a clinic, what do they do? Force you to eat, or you have this kind of regimented program that gets you on, and you
Yeah,
just change your behaviors?
they force you to eat. Some folks get put on a feeding
Amazing.
tube.
Cool.
It's really tough, and it's very serious and severe. I know a lot of people sort of think of eating disorders, they think of, oh, diets, things like that, but it's really not quite in the same
Yeah.
category.
Yeah.
So yeah, they force you to eat. There's a lot of top-down things being imposed upon you, especially when you're a kid and you don't really have any choice in the matter. And it's rough. It's why a lot of people don't do well in eating disorder treatment.
Yeah. So reading your book, I was thinking about the medical kind of disease model of mental health versus more, social effects or something like this. I'm curious what you think about that. In other words, let me just frame it this way. Let's say you're trying to lose weight. You're like Oprah. You put some on, you take some off, you try this, you try that. Now she's on Ozempic apparently or whatever. But she doesn't have an eating disorder. She's like most of us. Like, man, I'd really like to be a little skinnier. but we're still in the normal range of things where it becomes like an addiction, I guess, whereas you can't control it. I guess it would be the consequences to your life, like the analogy I make, do you have a problem with gambling or pornography or whatever it is? Well, if your spouse leaves you and you get fired from your job and you're homeless, you have a problem.
Right.
Maybe you gamble a little bit or you do this or that and you still have a job, you're happily married or whatever, then you don't have a problem. So I guess, is it a matter of degree or is there something that snaps where it's qualitatively different?
So you're talking about functional impairment, right? If there
Okay.
is impairment to an important life domain that really is crucial for you to have an okay existence, like work, like relationships, or school, or whatever, depending on your developmental stage, that clinically is what we qualify as a mental health disorder. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Psychiatry Bible, that's the definition of mental health problem or disorder is there functional impairment or not. So I think this stuff exists on a spectrum. I think it's also the case that you don't have to be dramatically underweight or overweight to have an eating disorder. You can have a very functionally impairing relationship with food and eating, with or without having your weight within a sort of what doctors would consider a typical range. So I really do think it comes down to the functional impairment piece.
Right. Okay. So your system that you're implementing, just kind of walk us through the mental health or just general healthcare system and how it's set up now and how you want to revise that. That's the big core of your program.
Yeah. Calling it a system is generous.
Okay. In dysfunctional system.
The situation.
Yeah.
The United States is real. I mean, we're facing a global mental health crisis, but I'll focus on the United States for ease of this conversation. About half of adults with mental health needs that are significant, where functional impairment is present, do not get any treatment. That number is close to 80% for children and adolescents. And there are lots of reasons for that, with the primary ones being that generally mental health care happens in brick and mortar clinics that a lot of people can't necessarily access. Shortages of mental health providers are the rule, not the exception. Most counties in the country are a federally designated mental health provider shortage area, which is wild to think about. If the number of licensed therapists miraculously were to double overnight, we would still fall like obscenely short of what we need to address mental health needs. Waiting lists, as a result, can be up to a year long, especially with kids. I see this over and over again. There's a 1 to 2 year wait for getting a psychiatry appointment, which is in the life of a kid completely pointless to even seek care at that point. Insurance coverage is unpredictable and often insufficient. Many psychologists and mental health professionals are driven away from even accepting insurance because the reimbursement rates are so low for them. So they actually couldn't make a living if they took insurance, which means if you want treatment, you pay out of pocket or you don't get it. And that's if you're lucky enough to live near somebody with the expertise you need. So it's just terrible. And I see these mental health awareness campaigns of, oh, just reach out for help and everything will be okay. You just need to ask for help. That's actually very harmful to say because you reach out and there's nothing there. There's nobody to help you. And the state and the severity of this lack of access to any kind of evidence-guided support is just maddening to me. And that's why I've pursued this research program on how can we create interventions that can fill these massive gaps that we have in the systems of care that exist already. Yes, we're going to need to put more infrastructure and support to broaden the systems that already exist, but that'll never be enough. So what else can we do? How can we get people help at points of need quickly that has some chance of doing something helpful? Not to cure everybody, but to help them in some way. And that's sort of the rationale for why single session interventions could be helpful. The other reality is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, sort of like the suicide hotline. Just, things are bad. I got to do something right now.
Yes, exactly. But the issues with suicide hotlines are multiple. One is that if you've ever called one, often you get put on hold.
Oh, no. I didn't know that.
Is deeply upsetting. The 988 rollout, not always, but it does happen where people get put on hold on the suicide hotline. So 988 was rolled out nationally as this new suicide sort of mental health crisis 911. But there's a risk that if you call that, the police could be called if you're not safe or you're a safety risk to others. And a lot of people don't want that, or a lot of people feel unsafe about that. There is sort of not a systematic approach to helping people who reach out for crisis support. So a lot of the time it's just folks providing general support and really just guessing at what could be helpful in that moment. It's not evidence-based necessarily. And the idea behind these single session interventions is that we can craft things that are based on science and that can be rigorously tested to produce positive outcomes instead of just guessing. and instead of having sort of unsystematic ways of reaching people in need.
Jessica, this is astonishing to me that the healthcare system hasn't figured this out yet. I mean, healthcare, HMOs, Kaiser, Blue Shield, I'm on now. You would think they want to save money and sort of streamline things. They would be all over this.
You would think
what's
so.
What's the problem?
I think this is a problem that, is pervasive even beyond mental health care, but our healthcare system is really reactive, not proactive. And prevention is deprioritized because we tend to wait for fires to burn entire cities before going and putting them out, basically. And that's a systemic problem in all of healthcare. But a more contextual problem with mental health in particular, it's that historically it's been siloed, it's been othered and separated from a lot of other physical healthcare services, such that, if you look at the history of asylums, which I talk about quite a bit in the book, they were literally out of sight, out of mind, get everybody who has these difficulties just out of view. And that's how mental health care was treated for a lot of its history. It's just in the past 50 or so years that we've even started to integrate mental health services back into sort of mainstream healthcare systems. And as a result, we're kind of ad hoc trying to cut and paste things to fit into physical healthcare systems to serve mental health, and it's just not worked very well. But that history of stigmatization and othering really set up mental health care systems to be poorly constructed at best.
When I was a undergraduate at Pepperdine University, a psych major, I took a course in abnormal psych. I think it was 75 or 1976. So part of our field work was we had to go up to Camarillo State Hospital, just right up the coast into Oxnard, which is now Cal State Channel Islands, which is kind of funny. But it was depressing. I mean, this was like a scene right out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, it was exactly like that. This is why I didn't go into clinical. I just spent a semester there, one day a week there. It's like, oh, I just want to put my head in the oven and just turn the gas on. I mean, oh my God, it was so depressing. I thought we were done with all that, but I don't know. What's the state of it now?
Well, there are a lot of theories about that. One is that we've transferred folks from reinstitutionalization, transferred folks from one form of incarceration in those mental institutions to prison. Right. And so we've repurposed the the incarceration that existed previously for those folks to being the prison system. Now, if you look at the numbers, that doesn't fully explain it, but there's been a lot of shift from those institutions becoming extremely overcrowded and unsustainable to the idea, at least, of wanting to create more outpatient mental health and community-based mental health centers, to what ultimately happens is those really never materialize, and a lot of people end up homeless or in prison or just without treatment altogether.
And is some of the blame put on the Reagan administration when they closed a lot of those institutions in the 80s?
Yeah, so that is part of the problem. And it's not that those institutions didn't need to be closed. A lot of them were extremely unsafe and unhelpful for people. They dramatically needed to be reformed in some way. But the promise then was to create and build up all this infrastructure in communities to support folks with mental health care. And that infrastructure never really took off in the way that it needed to in order to accommodate everybody's needs.
Okay, let's say after this recording, I call Blue Shield, my rep, or I was still on Kaiser, any of the big HMOs, and I say, okay, I'm not suicidal, but I'm really depressed. I have some serious personal issues. Do you cover this? And if so, how much do they cover? I mean, what's sort of typical for an HMO on those kinds of things?
So insurance payers really vary on what they cover, but it's not that they won't cover mental health treatment. They will, because by law they have to. It's who they will allow you to see with that coverage, for how many sessions, and does that person have the expertise relevant to your particular problem. So this is becoming less.
They have to be in the network. They have their own network of therapists and so on. I see.
Yes, they have to be in network, and finding somebody who's in network with the expertise you need, who who you click with and who you want to see, and who also practices evidence-based therapy, is somebody who I interviewed for the book called it like an act of God. Like it's just
Really?
It's really difficult to find all of those things in one place. And I
So
even hear this. I'm now a clinical psychologist, and I've sought treatment when I have all this training. It's hard for me.
What? Really? Don't you know everybody?
Well, that's part of the problem.
I see.
I don't want to go see my friends. But it's hard for me to find somebody in network who's available without a wait list, who I can afford to see.
Okay, so there's a pipeline issue here. Why aren't there 10,000 people like you doing single session interventions, and let's just overhaul the system?
Well, there are growing numbers of folks who are doing this kind of research, which I'm really, really excited about. But I just started in graduate school in 2016 is when I published my first paper on this topic. So it's been 8 years of really going all in on this topic. But it's becoming more popular, I think, as more people are aware of the fact that there's an entire evidence base supporting this approach. I think, there's been work done on single session therapy since the late 80s, early 90s, but much of it was clinical. So much of it was happening in clinics, folks observing clinically what was working and doing more of it, rather than folks who are scientists publishing about it and disseminating that information. And there's something in clinical psychology and psychiatry called the research practice gap, where people have their practice-based evidence and their science-based evidence, and they don't talk to each other. So I'm trying to, with this book, get people to talk to each other and bring the worlds together so this can be put into practice.
Yeah, that's, again, one of these things is kind of division in psychology between clinical and experimental, or evidence-based or not, or science-based or not. And, Carol Tavris used to write about this for us in Skeptic, that clinicians have a different idea of what counts as evidence. Not clinical trials, epidemiological, t-tests of different groups and control group and placebo group. Forget all that. This is my experience dealing with people that have this problem. There's no money balling of clinical psychology, in other words.
Yeah, it's difficult to cross that bridge, but in the book, that was my main rationale for including both interviews and a chapter on the evidence-based, the clinical trials, the 70 plus clinical trials that have been done on this topic.
Yeah.
Because they both matter, ultimately. Clinical trials that measure how many points on a scale did you reduce in depression won't tell you how someone experienced a turning point in their recovery. They won't tell you the qualitative lived pieces of it. And they do both matter. And I think the scientists have a lot to learn from folks who focus on qualitative, day-to-day practice-based evidence. And the practitioners have a lot to learn from the scientists too. But it's just a matter of figuring out how do we put that all together to make actual changes for people who need help right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been writing about this concept of does it work for my next book on truth. What is truth? The scientists have one version, but, anecdotally, people have different versions of truth. That lived experience idea. Okay, so here's my example, like Deepak Chopra, my friend. He's really into meditation. Okay, so does meditation work? Now someone could say, well, it works for me. It reduces my anxiety or my thought flooding or whatever, and I feel much better after I do it. Okay, but what Deepak wants, and a lot of people, does it really work? I mean, you do 5 sessions a week, 20 minutes a day, and it'll reduce the amount of measured anxiety or depression or chronic pain or whatever it is by 60% for the 1,000 people that tried it here. And so that's what, people like Deepak are looking for. And that's what you're after here. Some measurable, kind of operationally defined definition of what it means to work.
Precisely. Mm-hmm.
Right. All right. Let's look at, so I'm looking at your list here on your page 99 of the different issues that you've tried this single session systems out on: anxiety, depression, psychosis, bipolar, attention deficit, suicidal thought and behavior, borderline personality, eating disorder, substance abuse, and so on. Okay, so just take it. Just take any of them. Like, what would if I come to you and I have anxiety or whatever? What is it you're going to do?
Yeah, well, so that list, I believe that list was for people who I talked to who had experienced turning points in their recovery journeys.
Right.
So I talked to lots
Oh
of
yeah.
people with
Okay.
a lot of different experiences in terms of how they had recovered. With the single session interventions that my lab has worked on, so I mentioned the problem of a shortage of providers, right? So relying on people who have expert decades of training to deliver these interventions probably not going to work so well. So what we focused on in my lab and what we continue to focus on is digitally delivered interventions. Can we create an experience that's self-guided that can lead somebody to an insight or a shift in thinking or a shift in mindset that can matter for them in terms of how they approach challenges, how they think about their difficulties, or what they do next, their best next step. So we've put together these experiences, these interventions, mostly for adolescents, because that's my research focus, for depression. And all of these, by the way, are free. We don't gatekeep because that would be pretty counter to the point. So all of our interventions are freely available and anybody can try them out anonymously on our lab website. And so one intervention is called the ABC Project. ABC stands for Action Brings Change. When somebody first logs in to this intervention, which they can try anytime, anywhere, at moments of distress, they're told that we think we have some helpful ideas as scientists that could be useful for them, but we also want their input on how others like them can cope with distress. There's a whole lot of evidence out there that helping and volunteering, being pro-social, is actually curative, is actually beneficial for your own well-being and psychological state. So we have these interventions as not just opportunities to help yourself, but opportunities to use your lived experience to help others and what you learn in the program. They go through a series of exercises where they're taught a little bit about brain science, where they learn that because of how the brain works, for example, we're all capable of change. We're built that way. I know it feels like depression is set and stuck, but scientifically, that is not possible because you are a human and we all have built-in potential for change. So kind of dispelling the myth that depression is just a part of who you are. It's permanent. From there, we explain how what you do can shape how you feel and therefore thoughts and feelings and connections in your brain. We give them a little behavioral experiment in the program where they rate their mood, 0 to 10, 10 being best, 0 being worst. They pick a video to watch or a TikTok or a YouTube video that's very cute or funny. My favorite one that we have is a little porcupine eating a pumpkin and making little squealing sounds that you don't expect porcupines to make. It's wonderful. And then we ask them to rate their mood again. And we use that as a teaching moment of, wow, this random porcupine for 30 seconds detectively improved your mood just now. That is pretty cool. What would happen, do you think, if you made a point of 5 minutes every day connecting with someone who cares about you, who makes you feel good, take one step towards a goal that matters to you, and do something just for you because you deserve it? And we walk them through making an action plan for doing exactly that every day. That's the whole intervention. At the end of it, we ask, what advice would you give to somebody else based on what you just learned in your own experience for coping with depression? And if the teen gives us permission to anonymously share their feedback, we'll put it in our public advice center for everybody else to see. So they're contributing to something else. They walk away with an action plan. They feel empowered. The short-term outcomes we see to these interventions are a sense of reduced hopelessness from pre to post and even 3 months later, increases in perceived agency from pre to post and again 3 months later. And in trials, randomized clinical trials of thousands of teens all over the country, these are NIH-funded studies, we found that they reduced depression, anxiety symptoms, trauma-related symptoms, even restrictive eating 3 months later, compared to active placebo controls. And a little can do a lot. It's not going to do everything. It's not going to do the same amount for everybody, but it can do something. And I think that is important enough to disseminate.
That's amazing. But let me clarify something. So you have the single session where you walk them through, fill out the little form, and then watch the cat video or whatever. Finally, there's a good use of TikTok cat videos. Yay.
Yes. Social media for good.
But they don't just do that once. You've taught them, and then every day that when they feel this, they can queue up the video or whatever. And they do it themselves.
It's a moment in time where they discover their ability to do something about what they're experiencing that they didn't know they had before. That opens the door to other pathways, other steps they can take to improvement. So it's not that the single session alone is the cause for the improvement. It's the domino effect of what that allows them to do next. One of the people I interviewed for the book said, the turning point for me was when I realized that I can always take my best next step towards recovery. And that really resonated with me. And that's really what these interventions are designed to help people realize, is that you can put one foot in front of the other at any moment, and that can matter, even if in a small way.
So you're giving them tools to engage in on their own in the future, and you're giving them agency and power to do it without you.
Exactly, which teenagers don't get a lot of. They do not get a lot of agency in their everyday lives. And that's unfortunate, because seeking agency and independence is a developmental task. It's an essential developmental task of adolescence to assert agency and become agentic and make your own decisions. So we're leaning into that developmental need for autonomy in the interventions.
Yeah. I've been following for the last couple of years the path of Jordan Peterson, who's become a friend, but I've been fascinated by what a rock star he is. Oh my God. I mean, he has just massive following. I've never seen this in an intellectual ever, not even like Stephen Hawking or Noam Chomsky or Carl Sagan. I mean, he filled the O Arena in London. I mean, that's like 30,000, what is it, 30,000 people? I mean, something like Michael Jackson would fill. What is it about what he says? And it's something along the lines of what you're talking about. He's telling people, get your life in order. Here are a few really simple things, like make your bed, clean your room, just really basic stuff. And I remember when I first encountered it, I thought, did these people not have parents that walk them through this, or mentors or somebody? And maybe that's it. Maybe this kind of spike we have in teen anxiety and depression and so on, that's been well documented, I guess, since maybe 2015 or so, I guess, this phenomena. Maybe the parenting has changed, or something has changed, and kids are just not getting that. And they need this kind of structure that gives them agency and power.
Yeah, I think there's so many different causes to the reasons that anxiety and depression have been rising in adolescence. And I do think it's possible. Well, parenting can be, leveraged as a wonderful tool to help support brave behavior, approach behavior, agency in kids. That's absolutely true. What I also think is that the world is hard. And, especially for teenagers who are increasingly exposed to so much difficulty at rapid fire on a daily basis because of what the internet has become, it's easy to feel like nothing is in their control and their futures are out of control. So I think reorienting them to, here's one thing you can do just within yourself. It doesn't rely on the world being predictable. It doesn't rely on the future being X, Y, or Z, but you can always do something. I think that's a message they don't often get.
Do you have recommendations for parents of teens of screen time limitations or control of different sites that you don't want them on, or that kind of thing that could lead to destructive behavior?
I think it's a complicated topic with many complicated solutions, but personally, I as a psychologist, my answer would be conversations and openness and transparency and support are the keys to figuring out how to handle this in a particular circumstance. And by that, I mean, telling kids to do stuff just because will get them to do more of the thing, especially teenagers. Setting these hard and fast because I said so limits is going to make the thing more appealing. Developmentally, adolescents are wired to want to assert independence and make decisions and be a part of things and control their own lives. So leaning into that and going with it rather than trying to resist it is probably going to go better, both for opening up the lines of communication. So when teens are using the internet in ways that they're not sure about or they have thoughts about, they'll go to their parents and talk about it. And also for, at least having a dialogue of when different limits might need to be set. But they're then limits that are agreed upon by the teen and the parent, not just that are superimposed top down. Teens get enough of that in school, in their daily lives, of the top down, because I said so stuff. So that strategy is probably not going to be the most useful.
Yeah, but yeah, all right. I've been kind of following this debate the last couple of years with like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff with their coddling of the American mind, Gene Twenge, who studies generational differences.
Sure.
And they all seem pretty confident that the problem is real. It's not just some statistical artifact of surveys or something like that. There really are like twice as many boys and 3 times as many girls that are cutting and have suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, and so on than before. There's a generational difference. The Gen Z, what is going on? And I haven't seen a good answer, just like here's different theories. And I think maybe we don't know yet. But again, social media is always fingered as one of the causes. Whether it's the amount of screen time or the fear of being left out or fear of missing out, comparisons like what you described of body images, because that's all you look at all day is these images of perfect people. I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of all that.
Yeah, so I think the social media conversation is a really interesting and nuanced one that often gets taken really far in one direction or another, of like, it's all bad, or, things like that. And I just don't think that's useful, because frankly, a lot of kids and a lot of the teens that my lab serves find the internet crucial and social media crucial for coping. For example, sexual and gender minority teens who live in unaffirming environments, that is their entire source of social support and refuge, right? That is where they can find other people who understand them. That's where they can feel heard and connect with people who get them. And that's essential for mental health and well-being, is that form of connection. So saying, as a blanket rule, social media is bad, probably is a path to disadvantaging the kids who are already the most minoritized in their communities, who are struggling the most in their day-to-day life to connect with others. So I do think it's dangerous to say, like, full stop, social media is bad for teenagers. I do think it matters how teens use it, right? And teens who are already experiencing depression, way more likely to use social media in a way that's going to be affirming for their own emotional experience. They're going to seek out that content. They're going to search for things related to how they're feeling. So it's a cycle that it's hard to say whether that starts because the depression exists already or because of social media. But there's a way in which social media can reinforce mental health difficulties, or maybe set off people who are vulnerable to those difficulties that didn't exist before. But what I do think also is that we can use social media for good with mental health. And I think that's a really unappreciated part of this discussion. And I think single session interventions can play a role there. And what my lab has done in this area is we have a partnership with a digital mental health nonprofit called COCO. And COCO, which is directed by Rob Morris, who went to MIT, studied in MIT Media Lab, and has since founded this awesome nonprofit. He contracts with social media companies to embed mental health supports directly into their platforms, so that when people search for suicide or self-harm or cutting, COCO pops up and offers them support instead of that triggering content coming up. I think COCO's amazing. And we've been partnering for the past few years, and all of our evidence-based single session interventions are now embedded into COCO, so that when people search online on Tumblr, for example, for cutting or self-harm or suicide, right, they're offered an SSI, a single session intervention. So instead of going to down that spiral of triggering content, we can circumvent that. We can sort of derail them into doing something that could be helpful. And we've published on this. We've shown that it can be helpful in the moment and at least a few minutes later for folks in crisis. And so I think social media, yes, it can be really problematic, but it also presents an opportunity for just-in-time interventions, precisely when people need them, to offer support that can, fit into systems in ways that traditional therapies can't.
Yeah, I like that, because, there's these, calls to regulate, the government should regulate social media. It's like, really? Like what? I'm going to put some bureaucrat in charge of deciding what goes up on
Right.
Twitter or Facebook or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And what they have, 2 billion members of Facebook or whatever it is. Even if 1 million people quit,
Right.
they wouldn't even notice.
Yeah. And kids would just lie about their age. Like, if we're being
Right.
real, if we're saying, okay, nobody under 18 can use Twitter now, or not Twitter, that's over.
Right.
Instagram or TikTok or whatever, they just lie about their age and use it anyway. So we're either leaning into the reality of what's become of social media and working with young people to figure out how can we create systems that are going to work for you, or we make random top-down rules that they're not going to listen to anyway. And so I really think these solutions to figure out how can we embed opportunities for positive mental health and support into these spaces is a far better one than just saying no social media allowed.
Yeah. How does your program compare to, say, cognitive behavior therapy?
Yeah. So cognitive behavioral therapy is what I am, as a therapist, trained to deliver. I'm a fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. I think it has a place. Our interventions, our single session approaches, several of them can be considered kernels of cognitive behavioral therapy. Insights, individual messages that on their own have been demonstrated to have some positive impact. So in traditional cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, you learn a whole toolkit of skills, like different ways of coping with depression and symptoms related to depression as and when it comes up in your life. And you get this toolkit. And so you're supposed to be able to use different tools in the toolkit as and when needed. The single session intervention acknowledges the fact that the most common number of sessions people actually access is one, and tries to make the most of that first session. Rather than assuming people will just come back for 4 months once a week and get all these skills. So it's trying to distill and take little kernels of what we know is effective in CBT and deliver it at opportune moments, rather than relying on, well, we got to deliver this as a whole package.
And do you apply this to, say, adults? Maybe somebody loses a spouse or gets divorced, they get fired from their job.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling anxious or depressed, that's pretty normal to experience something like that. Absolutely.
And that's when another form, another therapeutic school of thought called solution-focused therapy comes into play. So the nice thing about single session therapy, there are a lot of turf wars and clinical psychology around like which theoretical orientation is best, psychoanalysis versus cognitive behavioral therapy. The nice thing about single session approaches is that it's not a theoretical orientation. It's a delivery package, a way of offering support. And you can use or borrow from any theoretical orientation and embed that into a single session treatment. So solution-focused therapy is another school of therapy, another theoretical orientation that you can embed in a single session model. In this model, it's a strengths-based approach. So rather than what CBT suggests, which is you lack skills, and by teaching you skills, you'll get better. Solution-focused brief therapy says, you already have skills. That's how you got this far in life. There's no way you could have gotten where we are right now without some kind of coping skill that's worked for you at some point. So let's spend a little bit of time figuring out what your strengths are, what's worked for you in the past, and how you can use it to get through what you're coping with now. So rather than trying to teach new skills, it helps people draw on their existing strengths to take one step in the right direction. And anybody, no matter what they're dealing with, can take one step in the right direction.
Okay, right. Small wins, I guess it's called.
Mm-hmm.
So the person that loses their job or spouse or gets divorced or something horrible happens, you're not saying, well, we're going to fix this. Whatever you're feeling is probably going to last a long time. Just try to make tomorrow just a tiny bit less painful than today.
Yeah.
Something like that?
Exactly. Take one step to make progress, even if it's small, towards the life that you want, because big steps are made up of hundreds of small steps. So the small steps are all necessary to getting to that future that you care about, that you value, that you want. And you can do that right now.
Yeah, you have a list here on your that you called try to name 3 small actions you can take to help you get 1 point higher on your miracle day scale.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you want to explain what the miracle day scale is, and then
Sure.
I'll read these.
So this is a technique used in solution-focused brief therapy. There are some exercises in the back of the book that are self-guided single-session interventions. This one is based on the single-session consultation. We first ask people to name their top problem, what's bothering them most. We then ask them to think about, okay, so what would have to change from now to the end of this session or the end of this exercise for you to feel like this mattered, this was useful? We call that a top hope for the session. So we quickly flip it from like, what is your problem to what do you hope for? What do you hope to change? The miracle day question is classic in solution-focused therapy. People are told to think about, imagine a miracle occurs. Overnight, the top problem that you just talked about disappears. Of course, you don't know that it's disappeared when you wake up in the morning because you were sleeping when it disappeared. So walk me through your day and tell me what tips you off that this miracle has occurred. How do you feel differently? What do you do differently? How are you thinking differently? And by walking yourself through this alternate reality where your positive future that you want is now something that you're steeped in, something that you're vividly imagining, you can rate today, how close are you to this miracle day being real? From a 0, furthest away possible, to a 10, I'm totally all the way there scale. So let's say you're at a 4 today, 4 out of 10, not really that close, but like I could be worse. Okay, great. The rest of the intervention is making an action plan to get 1 point higher on your scale. Totally unfair to ask you to get to a 10. That's unreasonable, and you're going to be sad if you try because it's not going to go well. It's impossible. But you can get to a 5. So what are you going to do to get to a 5? And that just helps people put one foot in front of the other where, getting to a 10 is usually what people want when they go to therapy, which seems insurmountable. But you can get to a 5. And that's a sense of accomplishment. That's a sense of agency that you didn't realize that you had. And that's the gist of what the intervention helps people do.
And would it work in the opposite direction? Say, my depression is I'm a 9 out of 10. It's really bad. And your hope is just to get me to an 8 tomorrow or the end of today or something like that.
Yeah. I think that could work. It's typically not how we approach things in a solution-focused framework, only because we're trying to get people to understand how can they leverage their strengths to move forward.
I see.
Rather than like, how can we reduce a problem? How can we increase a positive outcome? So it's just a little bit different framing wise. But in traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, most outcomes are based on, how severe are your symptoms, not how well are you doing.
What is that called? Systematic desensitization, right? Like if you're afraid of spiders, you're going to look at a picture of a spider, and then maybe there's one in the room and a cage on the other side. Then
Exposure therapy.
That's it. Yeah, exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy. I've done a lot of exposure therapy with myself and with patients.
You did personally? Why? For what?
Well, eventually for the eating disorder.
So I see. Okay.
Extraordinarily helpful. But actually, single session approaches have been, exposure therapy has been used in single session approaches as well. So a team named Austin Ollendick, who are researchers who've studied specific phobias for years in children and adults, have a single session therapy approach to treating phobias, where they condense an exposure therapy routine of systematically increasing the, approach to the feared situation, helps people get over a specific phobia in one session.
Well, okay, so here's some of the things you list. Talk to a friend, talk with a mentor, journal, by which you mean like have a diary, I guess. Check in with a group text, ask someone I trust for advice, play with a pet, exercise, do something nice for somebody else, play video games, meditate, do deep breathing, hold an ice cube until it melts. That sounds like big fun. Pray, make art, say something kind to myself, take a physical step back. There, the idea is, I guess, just do something. It doesn't really matter what it is.
That's right. And those are just suggestions for the 3-point action plan that can potentially help people get one step closer to their miracle day. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter as long as they choose and
Mm.
as long as they feel like, yeah, I can do that. That's the goal of the intervention, really, is to, by the end, leave people with a plan that they look at and they say, yeah, of course I can do that. Because that's that sense of agency that they didn't necessarily have at the start.
I like exercise. There's something, because I've always exercised pretty much every day, most of my life. And that seems to be a nice distraction. And plus, I get a workout in, which is good.
Yeah. I mean,
But
exercise
I
is
guess,
one of the.
yeah, moving, just doing something. It really doesn't matter what it is, I think.
Yeah. And taking the time to reflect on the fact that you can do something, and noticing yourself doing something and saying, yeah, I did that. I was struggling and I did something and I feel a tiny bit better. And that's cool that I have that ability.
Yeah. It's something that's measurable because I can post my workouts on Strava and go, oh, look, I
That's
did
true
that.
too. Yeah.
And another thing I do is work. I like, I'm a writer and editor. And whenever I'm going to write this essay, or I'm going to write an op-ed piece or review, or I'm going to work on this chapter for my next book, then, when I always feel better about this because look what I did. I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, okay, so maybe these other things that are bothering me, but I can't tell if I'm just distracting myself and just not thinking about the thing that makes me upset or sad, or if it's actually doing something. I think what you're saying is it actually does something for this other problem,
Yeah.
more than a distraction.
I think it can do something. And, I think the more we can construct these moments to help people feel agentic and like they can, like they have skills in their own life, like they have options for themselves, that can snowball and that can help people feel better over time.
Yeah. Yeah, you need the equivalent of a national hotline, suicide hotline for what you're doing so that everybody has that number. Because
Well,
what's the number you said? 80% of people at some point in their lives?
Yeah, so a huge number of people in epidemiological studies, the estimates that I've seen are between 50 and 80% will experience some kind of mental health problem. It's significant. And what I'd love to do is partner with organizations like 988 and suicide hotlines to embed single session approaches into those opportunities, to partner with social media platforms to embed single session approaches when people search for things like suicide or self-harm on these platforms. Because I think there are so many missed opportunities to offer people something that could matter. And that's why I wrote the book at the end of the day, is those partnerships need to happen. It's not going to happen if we just do this within academic circles.
Yeah. Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, you got to get out of the ivory tower, which is why I think I've always been fascinated by the self-help and actualization movement over since like the 1960s, or really even 50s, right? Napoleon Hill and what was Think and Grow Rich, and then what was the other one, Make Friends, and how to make friends and influence people.
How to make friends and influence people.
Yeah, those guys. That's all sort of post World War II movement of, and clearly, it's a huge business, like $1 billion business. These self-help books, the tapes, the posters, all this stuff. What is it that people need? I think you're tapping into it. It's like people are looking for something to do. I just got to do. I'm going to listen to the tape today, and I'm going to go do this thing that the guru told me to do. Whatever it's probably no one, Tony Robbins, whoever. Probably no one has the formula. It's probably just do something. And this guy's telling me to do something, so that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. I think that, and I think there are certain things that are more reliably helpful to do than other things to some degree, which is why we try to streamline the interventions to focus on these evidence-based kernels.
But you're science-based. This is what I like about your program. It's science-based, data-based.
And
right, I don't know. Did you ever see that documentary film? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say I think another key difference between these self-help sort of gurus, as you say, the goal there wasn't to democratize access to mental health support. The goal in a lot of ways was to help people feel empowered, but often to get them on a specific program, a specific sort of path, and buy more books and more tapes and all the things and all. Yeah. And what I'm hoping and what my lab is doing is we are literally giving it away. I it is open access.
Nice.
All of the intervention materials are freely available. They're posted on Open Science Framework, Creative Commons licenses for everything. And the goal here is for this approach to get out there, and for more people to be able to incorporate it into whatever support system they're already offering people. And I think, a lot of these solutions, a lot of mental health interventions have suffered from this problem of like copyright of, everything being locked behind paywalls. And I'm hoping that by literally giving away the self-help exercises at the end of this book and between our website and everything else, people will just run with this. That's my hope.
Yeah, nice. I like that. Yeah, we did a cover story on self-help movement. Steve Salerno wrote this, a book on the self-help actualization movement. He was the head of self-help books for Rodale Press, which is one of the biggest publishers of self-help books. So I'll never forget his line, which was the number one predictor of who would buy one of these books is who's already bought one of those books.
Yes.
so yeah. My initial reaction was, well, if it works, why do you have to keep buying the books? But maybe part of it too is it's a daily affirmation thing, right? I mean, you said it, life is hard, and life's going to be hard all over again tomorrow. So maybe I just kind of need to get up and remind myself, okay, shit's going to happen. So here are my tools to deal with whatever happens. I don't even know what's going to be today.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right, Jessica. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to ask you, kind of the big picture. Let's see. Oh, I did want to ask you just a few things. What is borderline personality? Some of these things I don't know too much about. That and the bipolar. Well, I guess bipolar is manic depression. What is borderline personality?
Oh, so borderline personality disorder is one of the personality disorders that's defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's really centered on an instability of sense of self and instability in relationships, and often reactivity in a big way to stressors. So really intense emotional responses and often really protracted emotional responses to things that wouldn't necessarily cause emotional responses in other people. A lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of uncertainty about who you are, and a lot of that comes out in difficulties in interpersonal relationships.
Oh, the other thing I want to ask you, the difference between goals and values.
Yeah. So a goal is a discrete place you want to go, thing you want to achieve, task you want to complete. A value is a direction in life that matters to you. You can't achieve a value. You can achieve a goal. A value is, for me, let's say friendship. If friendship matters to me, that's not a goal that I can work towards. That's just something that I
got my friend, I'm done.
Right. Yes, I did it. I acquired the friends, all of them. That's not really how it works. But you can take actions each day that align with that value. Right. So a value is sort of a roadmap for where you want to go next. A goal is a specific destination that you want to arrive at. And aligning these daily activities that can matter for you with whatever your values are is a really nice way of ensuring that each day you're engaging in something that's going to be important and going to be meaningful.
So you have this line, action brings change, which made me think about different theories of emotions. One of which is that I act a certain way and then my, I guess, cortex or somewhere in the higher system reads the bodily changes and labels that fear or anger or jealousy or sadness or whatever. Or does the emotion come first and then the bodily changes happen? It sounds like you're citing on the first one. The action brings the emotions and change.
I think both are true. Both can be true. And I think a lot of folks who, in cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, there's this triangle that we show everybody at the very start of treatment, thoughts at the top, feelings on one end, and behaviors on the other end. And there are bidirectional arrows across all of them. So you start with whatever you can do. If it's really hard to change your thoughts or your feelings, do something. If it's really hard to act, try meditation or some kind of bodily exercise that allows your body to physiologically decompress. And that can lead to changes in any of the other domains. So I think there are lots of paths to making incremental steps that are important and additive for you. But I think both are true with those theories.
Yeah, interesting. So just smiling or saying hi to somebody and saying something nice, even if I don't want to do it, is going to change how I actually feel about myself for doing that. Something like that.
It can. In a way, it has to. Because everything we do affects everything we do next.
I see.
So yeah, it may not be major, but it's going to be something.
Yeah. All right, Jessica, that's a good place to stop. I think your book is really important. I mean, I just can't emphasize enough. This is astonishing to me that the HMOs have not already figured this out long ago. Let's hope that they do now, given the massive amount of money spent on healthcare and how inefficient the whole system is. It's just amazing. Yeah, you have that story about I guess it was your mom or parents or whatever calling to get you help. And, well, we have an opening 6 months from now. Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a problem. I had a relative who had alcohol issues, and I looked into one of these places where you send them off for the week, right? It was like $10,000 or something. It's like, what?
Yeah, it's not reasonable.
I mean, who could afford
like, who is this for?
This is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it may have been one of those places in Malibu or something. Maybe the celebrities can go; they can afford it. But anyway, for the rest of us, get the book: Little Treatments, Big Effects: How to Build Meaningful Moments That Can Transform Your Mental Health. Jessica, thanks for writing the book. Thanks for your work. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. Great to chat.